In October 2024, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics to Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson in recognition of their decades of research, which shows that the crux of economic prosperity lies in the nature and integrity of a nation's institutions and challenges traditional ideas that attribute national success to geography, culture, or natural resources. Their collective work has proven that the single biggest reason why some nations flourish while others remain mired in poverty is the strength and credibility of social institutions, particularly their political and legal systems, economic frameworks, and law enforcement. And their branch of study remains highly relevant today, as the gap between developed and developing nations continues to be vast. So what are the root causes of the disparity between rich and poor countries, and why do some nations thrive while others struggle? Well, the trio's core ideas are conveniently brought together in the New York Times best-selling book, Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. In it, Acemoglu and Robinson explore the different performance of countries with inclusive institutions and those with extractive institutions. They establish that inclusive institutions are those that allow and encourage widespread participation by all of society in economic activities, ensuring secure property rights and a level playing field. And they prove that these inclusive institutions foster innovation, economic growth, and development. In contrast, extractive institutions concentrate power and opportunity in the hands of a few, an elite, leading to stagnation, corruption, and poverty. Institutions that serve a narrow elite don't just make economic growth more difficult, they stop it from happening altogether. In these systems, the rules are set up to protect the interests of those in power, not to encourage innovation, investment, or productivity. When people fear that they won't benefit from their hard work because their property can be taken, contracts won't be enforced, or success might just attract unwanted political attention, they stop trying. There's no reason to start a business, invent a new product, or invest in skills if the rewards can be arbitrarily taken away. Similarly, if companies can't rely on courts to make defaulters pay, they avoid lending and trade. If licenses or approvals are handed out based on connections rather than merit, talented newcomers get blocked, while inefficient or corrupt firms thrive. The result is not just inefficiency or slower growth, it's stagnation. In these environments, the entire economy is shaped around extracting value rather than creating it. Innovation becomes a threat to those in power, so they actively suppress it. Growth doesn't just slow down. It never takes off because the incentives are all wrong. The system rewards loyalty, connections, and corruption, not effort, talent, or creativity. Economic progress requires open competition and secure rights, and when those are missing, growth is impossible. The authors prove their central argument, that inclusive institutions lead to prosperity, while extractive ones lead to poverty, using both econometric analysis and compelling real-world examples. On the technical side, they employ econometric techniques to isolate the effects of institutions from other factors like geography or disease environment. They proved that where the disease environment was more hospitable, like in the USA or Canada, Europeans were more willing to settle, and thus more likely to establish inclusive institutions that protected property rights, upheld the rule of law, and encouraged economic participation. And these colonies performed significantly better. But their most striking evidence comes not from statistical models, but from vivid historical and geographic case studies. One of the clearest demonstrations is the town of Nogales, which sits on the US-Mexico border. The northern half of the town lies in Arizona, the southern half in Sonora, Mexico. The geography, climate, and even the ethnic makeup of the people are virtually identical. Yet the two halves have starkly different levels of income, infrastructure, and public services. Why is that? Well, it's because they exist under entirely different institutional systems. In the north, inclusive political and legal institutions protect individual rights and support a market-based economy. In the south, extractive institutions controlled by a narrower elite have historically restricted opportunity and innovation. The same dynamic plays out on a larger scale in Korea. Before the Korean War, the Korean peninsula was a single country with a shared history, culture, and language. But after the war, it was split in two. North Korea developed an extreme form of extractive authoritarian rule, while South Korea gradually built more inclusive institutions. Today, North Korea remains one of the poorest and most repressive countries in the world, while South Korea has become a vibrant, innovative economy. More generally, in places like South America, the Caribbean, and India, where there were large indigenous populations or easily extractable resources, European powers established institutions designed to exploit local labor and funnel wealth back to Europe. These extractive institutions were never intended to encourage local development or widespread prosperity. They were about control and profit for the few. But in contrast, in places like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, where large-scale exploitation of native populations was either not possible or not sustainable, colonial powers were forced to attract European settlers. To do this, they created institutions that respected property rights, established fair courts, and encouraged entrepreneurship. These inclusive systems laid the foundation for long-term economic growth, innovation, and prosperity. The results are clear. The nations that inherited inclusive institutions have become some of the richest and most stable in the world, while those burdened with extractive systems continue to struggle with poverty and underdevelopment. But perhaps the most thought-provoking conclusion in why nations fail is that the Industrial Revolution wasn't primarily driven by technological breakthroughs. It was driven by institutional change. This turns the conventional story on its head. Most people think of the Industrial Revolution as a sudden burst of inventions, steam engines, mechanized looms, railways, that catapulted Britain into economic dominance. But Acemoglu and Robinson argue that the real driver wasn't the technology itself, but the political and economic institutions that enabled people to develop, adopt, and profit from that technology. They trace this back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when King James II was overthrown and replaced by William of Orange. This moment marked a fundamental shift in British politics. Power moved away from the monarchy and toward Parliament, creating a system of checks and balances that limited the ability of elites to extract wealth for themselves at the expense of everyone else. Crucially, it also strengthened property rights, made taxation more predictable, and ensured that courts could enforce contracts independently of royal interference. These institutional reforms had huge economic consequences. For the first time, inventors, entrepreneurs, and investors could operate in an environment where they had a reasonable expectation that they would benefit from their efforts. Innovation became something worth pursuing. Banks could lend, companies could grow. People had incentives to experiment, invest, and take risks because they could trust the rules of the game. The technology for industrialization had been available for centuries. The Romans had advanced engineering, aqueducts, water mills, and even rudimentary steam power, but these tools never led to sustained economic growth because the institutional framework was extractive. The elites of Roman society, and of countless empires since, had little incentive to encourage broad-based innovation or empower ordinary people. In fact, they often actively suppressed change to maintain control. So while knowledge existed, it sat idle. That means humanity had the tools for progress, but waited more than 1,700 years for the right institutions to unlock their potential. In that sense, the Industrial Revolution didn't happen because someone invented the steam engine. It happened because Britain had created a system where innovation could flourish. The real revolution was institutional. Acemoglu and Robinson also make a powerful point that progress is not inevitable. Just because a country is rich or developed at one point in time doesn't mean it will stay that way. Institutions can be built, but they can also be weakened or destroyed. The authors use Argentina as a vivid case study to show how nations can slide backwards when their institutions are undermined. In the early 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. It had vast natural resources, booming exports, and living standards that rivaled Europe. But instead of using that wealth to build strong, inclusive institutions that would support long-term development, Argentina was run by a narrow elite, an oligarchy who were more interested in preserving their own power and wealth than expanding opportunity for the broader population. Then came Juan Perón, who promised redistribution and social justice, but instead of strengthening institutions like an independent judiciary, the free press, or the protection of property rights, he did the opposite. In the name of helping the people, he centralized power, eroded democratic checks, weakened the courts, and suppressed dissent. What followed was a long, painful decline, marked by hyperinflation, debt defaults, capital flight, political instability, and repeated economic crises. Acemoglu and Robinson use this example to show that initial prosperity means nothing without institutional resilience. A nation can be wealthy, but if its leaders undermine the rule of law, if they tilt the playing field to favour themselves or their allies, if they silence opposition or hollow out public institutions, then that wealth will not last. That means Argentina's story is a warning. Even rich countries are vulnerable. So what should we do? In Why Nations Fail, Acemoglu and Robinson are ultimately optimistic, but cautiously so. They argue that the key to lasting prosperity is the development of inclusive institutions, the kind that distribute power broadly, protect property rights, uphold the rule of law, enable free markets, and give people a genuine voice in both the political and economic life of a country. But while the solution is clear, the path to achieving it is anything but easy. That's because the greatest obstacle to progress is often the very people who hold power, the entrenched elite. These elites benefit from extractive institutions that allow them to control resources, monopolize opportunities, and suppress competition. Inclusive reforms may be good for the country as a whole, but they often represent a direct threat to the personal wealth and authority of those at the top. As a result, the elite resists change, sometimes violently. They may suppress dissent, rig political systems, co-opt reformers, or create just enough illusion of progress to maintain their grip. This is what Acemoglu and Robinson call the political trap. The people who need to be removed for reform to happen are the very ones who control the levers of change. International aid doesn't fix this. The book is quite skeptical of foreign assistance, noting that aid often reinforces extractive systems unless it is delivered through or helps build inclusive institutions. In many cases, aid props up corrupt regimes, provides resources that the elite can control, or reduces the pressure for internal reform. It may build schools or clinics in the short term, but it rarely changes the underlying power structures that keep countries poor. So what does work? Historically, regime change has sometimes opened a window of opportunity, but this too is fraught. Revolutions and coups often simply replace one elite with another. External interventions like foreign invasions or diplomatic pressure are rarely effective in creating stable, inclusive institutions. Acemoglu and Robinson argue that change usually comes from within, when new social groups or coalitions gain strength and are able to push for reform. This process is slow, uncertain, and often marked by setbacks. It does not happen automatically. So to conclude, the key takeaways are that the greatest asset any country has is its people. But without the right institutions, that potential goes to waste. Why Nations Fail shows that economic success doesn't come from geography, resources, or luck, but from inclusive institutions, rule of law, secure property rights, free speech, and a system that rewards effort over connections. These create the space for bold ideas and risk-taking, the real engines of growth. When people know they'll benefit from their work, they strive and innovate. But where corruption rules, the incentive shifts, from building something new to gaming the system. In a corrupt society, the incentive is not to be innovative, it's to be corrupt. But the most important takeaway from Why Nations Fail is this: good institutions are worth fighting for and have to be defended. If anyone ever doubted the value of free speech, the rule of law, or accountable government, this book is the wake-up call. It shows, with powerful evidence, that these aren't just ideals, they are the foundation of prosperity. But perhaps the deeper lesson is that good institutions are precious because they don't emerge automatically. In economics, many problems sort themselves out. If there's a shortage, prices rise. If there's a trade deficit, the currency adjusts. If housing is unaffordable, people move to cheaper areas. But what the authors highlight is a profound market failure. Bad governments don't correct themselves. In fact, they entrench themselves. Corrupt regimes become self-reinforcing, resisting reform and suppressing opposition. They survive not because they work, but because they crush anything that might challenge them. You can see this everywhere, from the many countries still ruled by despots decades after independence, to the 2,000-year-long delay between the Roman invention of steam power and the British Industrial Revolution. Finally, good institutions are rare and fragile. They are rare because across history and around the world, they emerge only under special circumstances. The Industrial Revolution didn't happen because of technology. It happened because Britain developed institutions that rewarded risk-taking and protected individual rights. And they are fragile because even countries that once flourished, like Argentina, can fall. So the biggest takeaway is this: you have to fight for free speech, the rule of law, and inclusive institutions, and you have to fight to maintain them. Because once a corrupt leader takes power, they install other corrupt people in positions of control, and inevitably it becomes harder and harder to remove them. A link to the next video should be on your screen now. Just click to keep watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like, subscribe, and follow. Thanks for watching.